Growing up, camping was my escape from the pressures of school and life. Every summer, my friends and I would head to Pine Ridge, a secluded area known for its towering trees and serene lakes. This year, we decided to explore a new camping site deep in the woods, away from the usual trails and familiar campsites. Little did we know that our adventure would lead us into a nightmare. We arrived at the campsite just as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine and earth. We set up our tents and started a fire, the crackling flames creating a warm glow that pushed back the encroaching darkness. As we gathered around the fire, we shared stories of past trips, laughing and joking. I felt a sense of excitement and freedom that only camping could provide. But as the night wore on, a chill settled in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Is it just me, or does it feel like someone's out there? I asked, scanning the tree line. My friends shrugged, laughing it off. It's just the woods, one of them said. But the feeling lingered. Later that night, as we settled into our tents, I was jolted awake by a rustling sound outside. I sat up, straining to listen. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on leaves and twigs. I glanced at my watch. It was past midnight. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, peeking outside. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the moonlight cast eerie shadows across the campsite. The trees swayed gently in the wind, but there was no sign of life. I shook my head, thinking I was just being paranoid, and crawled back into my sleeping bag. The next morning, I shared my experience with the group. They were skeptical but agreed to keep an eye out. We spent the day hiking through the woods, exploring the area, and enjoying nature. But as evening approached, the strange feeling returned, stronger than before. That night, as we sat around the fire, we heard a low humming sound drifting through the trees. It was haunting, almost melodic, and sent shivers down my spine. "Do you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, but it's probably just the wind," one friend replied, though he sounded unsure. We tried to ignore it and continued our conversation, but the humming only grew louder, echoing around us. Suddenly, one of my friends jumped up, pointing into the darkness. "Look!" he shouted. We all turned to see a faint light flickering among the trees, moving slowly toward us. The humming intensified, and we could see shapes dancing in the shadows, as if they were beckoning us to follow. "Let's go check it out," my adventurous friend exclaimed, and before I could voice my concern, he took off into the darkness. The rest of us hesitated, but eventually followed, curiosity getting the better of us. We moved cautiously through the trees, the light ahead growing brighter. The humming filled the air, wrapping around us like a blanket. It was mesmerizing, and I found myself wanting to get closer. As we reached a clearing, we were met with a sight that made my stomach drop. In the center of the clearing stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows glowing with the same eerie light. The humming emanated from within, and shadowy figures danced in the flickering glow. The sight was both beautiful and terrifying. "What is this place?" I whispered, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. Before anyone could answer, a woman stepped out from the cabin. She had long, flowing hair and wore a dress that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. Her eyes sparkled like stars, and she smiled warmly at us. "Welcome, travelers," she said, her voice soft and inviting. "You've come to join us, haven't you?" "Join you?" I echoed, my heart racing. "What do you mean?" "We've been waiting for you," she replied, her smile widening. "You are drawn here for a reason. You can stay with us forever." My friends looked captivated, but something deep inside me screamed to run. "No, we need to go back," I insisted, grabbing one of my friend's arms. "We don't belong here." But it was too late. The shadowy figures from the cabin stepped closer, their forms swirling in and out of the light. I could see their faces now, hollow and haunting, with empty eyes that seemed to peer into my soul. Panic surged within me. "Run!" I shouted, turning to flee back into the woods. My friends hesitated for just a moment before following, but I could hear the whispers of the figures behind us, urging us to return. We ran through the dark forest, branches scratching at our arms and faces as we pushed through the underbrush. The humming faded, but the feeling of being chased remained. I didn't stop until we reached our campsite, gasping for breath. We quickly packed our things, fear making us move faster than I thought possible. The sun was starting to rise, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange, but I knew we weren't safe yet. As we drove away from Pine Ridge, I glanced back in the rearview mirror. The cabin was gone, replaced by an empty clearing, but I could still see the shadowy figures lurking in the trees, their eyes glowing like embers in the early morning light. "Did that really happen?" one of my friends asked, disbelief etched on their face. It did, I said, my heart heavy with the knowledge that we had barely escaped whatever dark fate awaited us. But as we drove further from the woods, a thought nagged at me. I glanced at the passenger seat, where my backpack sat. Something glimmered in the sunlight, an old pendant, engraved with the same symbols we had seen at the campsite. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I realized that our encounter with the shadows of Pine Ridge might not be over after all. I've always been drawn to the outdoors, so when my friends suggested a camping trip deep in the woods, I couldn't say no. We packed our gear, eager for a weekend away from city life. We found a spot by a crystal clear lake, far away from any other campers. It was perfect, or so we thought. Our first day was amazing. We set up our tents, cooked over an open fire, and swapped stories late into the night. The stars were brilliant, and the only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. But as the fire died down, and one by one, my friends drifted off to their tents, I started to feel uneasy. I was the last one awake, staring into the dying embers, when I noticed something odd. A faint whisper carried on the wind. At first I thought it was my imagination, but then it grew louder, like dozens of voices murmuring all at once. I scanned the tree line, but everything was still. I shook it off as just a trick of the wind and crawled into my tent. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange scratching sound. It was coming from right outside my tent. I held my breath, my heart pounding, and listened carefully. It wasn't just random noise. It sounded like something was deliberately clawing at the fabric. "Guys, is that you?" I called out, but there was no answer. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside, but nothing was there, just darkness and the silhouette of my friends' tents. I sighed, zipped my tent back up, and tried to get back to sleep. The next morning, I noticed something odd. Strange symbols were drawn around our campsite in the dirt. They looked ancient, like some sort of ritual markings, and they surrounded us in a perfect circle. I asked my friends if they were playing a prank, but they all swore they hadn't seen them before. "Probably just some weird forest thing," one of them shrugged, brushing it off. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we decided to take a hike around the lake. It was beautiful, the water reflecting the fiery colors of the sky. But then we stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. There, half buried in the mud by the lake, was an old decaying leather-bound journal. I picked it up, curious, and wiped off the dirt. The pages were brittle and yellowed with age, filled with handwritten notes and strange sketches. One page caught my eye. It showed the exact symbols we had seen around our campsite, along with a warning: "Do not stay after dark. They will come." I felt a chill run down my spine, showed it to my friends. They laughed it off, saying it was just someone's idea of a joke. But deep down I knew something wasn't right. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up and the trees swayed, casting eerie shadows over our tents. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, I heard it again, the scratching sound. But this time it wasn't alone. There were footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around our campsite. I could hear the soft crunch of leaves and the faint whispers, like they were speaking in some ancient language. I unzipped my tent just a crack and froze. There were figures standing around us just outside the circle of symbols. They were tall and thin, with elongated limbs, their bodies twisted in unnatural angles. Their faces were hidden by shadows, but I could see their eyes, glowing a faint, eerie green. I wanted to scream, to warn my friends, but I couldn't move. One of the figures stepped forward, its bony hand reaching out to touch the invisible barrier created by the symbols. As soon as its fingers brushed the line, it let out a high-pitched shriek and the other figures backed away. I quickly zipped my tent back up, shaking with fear. My friends woke up, asking what was wrong, but I couldn't find the words. "We need to leave," I finally managed to whisper. Now, we packed up our things as quickly as we could, and just as we were about to leave, I glanced back one last time. The figures were still there, watching us, their glowing eyes following our every move. We raced to the car and sped down the dirt road, desperate to put as much distance as possible between us and that cursed campsite. But as we reached the main road, I realized I still had the old journal clutched in my hands. I opened it one last time, hoping for some explanation, but there was only one final entry: "You can't escape, they follow." As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and felt my blood run cold. Standing in the middle of the road, their eyes glowing green in the darkness, were the figures. They watched us as we disappeared into the night, and I knew, deep down, that they would always be watching. I've always loved the mountains, so when I finally got a weekend off, I decided to pack up my camping gear and head out for a solo trip. I thought a bit of peace and quiet in nature would be the perfect escape from my busy life. I had no idea that this trip would turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. I reached the mountain campsite late in the afternoon. It was remote, far from any towns or other people, just the way I wanted it. I parked at the edge of an old dirt road, grabbed my gear, and started hiking up the trail. After about an hour, I found a perfect spot. A small clearing overlooking a valley, surrounded by tall trees. It was absolutely breathtaking, and I felt lucky to have this place all to myself. I quickly set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and settled in as the sun started to dip below the horizon. The air grew colder, so I lit a fire, warming my hands as the sky turned dark. It felt good to be surrounded by nature, with only the crackling flames and the whispering wind for company. But as night settled in, I started to hear something else. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the sound of the fire. It sounded like singing. I paused, listening more intently. It was a soft, haunting melody, echoing through the trees. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind, but the longer I listened, the clearer it became. It was a woman's voice, humming a slow, eerie tune. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me in the darkness. I tried to ignore it and went back to my tent, zipping it up tight. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling of my tent, trying to sleep, but the singing didn't stop. It grew louder, more distinct, as if the voice was drawing closer. My heart began to race. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. There was no response, only that eerie melody drifting through the night. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and shined it into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the trees, but there was nothing, just the empty woods. But when I turned back toward my tent, I saw her. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a woman. Her long, tangled hair covered most of her face, and she wore a torn, dirty white dress that hung from her thin frame. Her arms hung limply at her sides, and she was swaying gently, humming that haunting tune. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. I was paralyzed with fear. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Help me." I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who are you?" I asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she took a step closer, and I saw her eyes. They were empty, dark pits that seemed to swallow all the light around them. My instincts kicked in, and I turned and ran. I grabbed my backpack, not caring about anything else, and sprinted through the trees. Branches scratched at my face and arms, but I didn't stop. I could still hear her humming, that chilling melody echoing through the forest, growing louder as if she were right behind me. I finally reached the dirt road where I had parked my car. I jumped inside, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys and started the engine. As I drove down the mountain, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, but the singing still echoed in my ears. I thought I was safe, that I had escaped. But then I realized something. I had left my phone back at the campsite. I felt sick to my stomach, but I knew I had to go back for it. I took a deep breath, turned the car around, and drove back up the mountain, praying that I wouldn't see her again. When I reached the campsite, everything was exactly as I had left it. My phone was lying on the ground next to the tent. But as I picked it up, I noticed something else. In the dirt, just outside my tent, were footprints. Large, deep footprints that led right up to where I had been sleeping. They weren't mine. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone, and that's when I noticed a new message on the screen. It was from an unknown number, and it simply read, "Why didn't you help me?" My heart nearly stopped. I ran back to my car, jumped in, and drove as fast as I could down the mountain road. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the road, her head tilted to the side, her eyes locked onto mine. Her mouth curved into a twisted smile, and as I drove away, I saw her lift her hand, waving slowly as if saying goodbye.